James always told his son, Daniel, to go to bed and wait for the Sandman. It was a peculiar phrase, one James didn't even know why he said. It wasn't something he grew up hearing, nor did it mean anything specific. Still, Daniel took it seriously, asking over breakfast one morning, "What does the Sandman look like?" James, distracted while flipping eggs in a pan, brushed it off. "It's just an expression," he said, setting the plate in front of Daniel and giving him a kiss on the head. He thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Later that night, as James did his routine check on Daniel before going to bed, he froze in the doorway. Sitting on the edge of Daniel's bed was ... something. At first, James thought it was a man. Pale, hairless, and hunched over, the figure rocked back and forth, its back to him. But when it turned, James saw it clearly, and his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a man at all. Its body was grotesque, twisted in ways that defied anatomy. Its joints bent the wrong way. Its limbs moved as if controlled by invisible strings, jerking unnaturally. Its face, if you could call it that, was a pale, shapeless mass, devoid of eyes or a mouth. James wanted to scream, but terror locked his throat. He felt warmth spreading down his leg before the primal need to protect his son overtook him. "Daniel," he shouted, rushing to the bed. The thing didn't move as he grabbed Daniel, who was wide-eyed but eerily calm. Holding his son close, James backed toward the door, expecting the creature to lunge at them. But it didn't. Instead, it tilted its head in an almost curious manner before scuttling toward the window in a jerky, stop-motion-like crawl. It disappeared into the night, leaving nothing but the billowing curtains behind. The police came, but James didn't know what to tell them. How could he explain what he had seen? Daniel's version of events didn't help. He described a man in a mask, a burglar, nothing more. James wanted to believe that. A man in a mask was something he could understand, something the police could handle. But deep down, he knew better. The following nights were restless. They stayed in a hotel, installed a new security system, and even put bars on the windows. Yet James couldn't shake the memory of that thing. He lay awake, eyes darting to every shadow, every creak of the house sending his heart racing. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed unbothered. When asked if he was afraid, he simply shook his head and went to bed without a fuss. James envied his son's calm, but then, 2 weeks later, Daniel stopped talking. At first, James chalked it up to a phase. Kids go through them. But as the silence stretched on, worrying set in. The doctors found nothing physically wrong. Could be trauma, they said. Sometimes these things surface later. James wasn't convinced. Trauma couldn't explain the way Daniel's eyes darted to the corners of the room, or how he flinched at shadows. It couldn't explain the faint, rhythmic tapping James started hearing at night, coming from Daniel's room, by the pale figure that skittered into the hallway ahead of them. It moved on all fours, its limbs bending grotesquely in ways that made James's stomach churn. Its skin was waxy and pallid, stretched tight over a body that seemed just slightly wrong, like a blurry imitation of human anatomy. Its head cocked unnaturally to one side, and though it had no eyes, James could feel it watching him, feel its attention crawling over him like ants. "Get away from us," James screamed, clutching Daniel tighter. He backed away, his legs trembling, but the thing didn't move closer. Instead, it raised one long, spindly finger and pointed. Not at James, but at Daniel. James looked down. Daniel was completely still, his face expressionless. His lips began to move, but no sound came out. James shook him, desperate to wake him from whatever trance he was in, but his son's vacant stare didn't waver. The creature clicked its jaw, a sickening, bone-grinding sound that echoed down the hallway and began crawling forward. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a stop-motion puppet brought to life. "No," James yelled, turning to flee. He barreled down the stairs, gripping Daniel so tightly he could feel the boy's heartbeat. Was that his own, hammering in his ears? He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get out. He reached the front door and yanked it open, the night air rushing in like a wave of relief. But as he stepped outside, he froze. The yard was full of them. Pale figures, identical to the one inside, standing motionless in the dark, their heads tilted at impossible angles, their bodies swaying ever so slightly, as if blown by a breeze no one else could feel. The streetlights flickered, casting jagged shadows across their grotesque forms. James backed up, slamming the door shut. He was trapped, his mind raced, desperate for a plan, any plan. He turned to the kitchen, grabbed the largest knife he could find, and stood between Daniel and the inevitable. The creature from the hallway appeared in the doorway, its body folding and unfolding as it crawled toward them. Behind it, the others began to scratch at the windows, their clawed hands leaving long, screeching trails in the glass. "What do you want?" James screamed, his voice cracking. The creature stopped, its head tilted, and for a moment, James thought it might actually answer. Then, slowly, it raised one long finger again pointing at Daniel. James's grip on the knife tightened. "You can't have him," he snarled. The creature's head twitched, its mouth stretching into a grotesque approximation of a smile. And then it spoke, in Daniel's voice. "He's already ours." James's world tilted. He looked down at his son, who now wore that same horrifying smile. Daniel's hands reached up, impossibly strong, gripping James's wrist and forcing him to drop the knife. "Daddy," Daniel said, his voice sweet and familiar, but his eyes were wrong. They were empty, hollow. James stumbled back, tripping over a chair and falling to the floor. The creature loomed over him, and Daniel, or whatever Daniel had become, stood beside it, holding out a hand. "Come with us, Daddy," Daniel whispered. James shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "You're not my son," he choked out. The last thing James saw was Daniel's blank, smiling face as the pale figures closed in. And then, there was only darkness. The hallway seemed to stretch infinitely, the walls closing in around James like a suffocating vice. The thing squatting on its haunches had stopped rocking. It was utterly still now, its head tilted slightly, observing James with a curious malice. James clutched at the empty space where Daniel had been, his chest heaving with the effort of trying to breathe. The walls, once familiar, now seemed alien, as though the house itself had turned against him. He staggered backward, his fingers trailing across the wall that had once led to Daniel's room. "Why are you doing this?" James screamed, his voice cracking, raw with desperation. "What did I do to deserve this?" The pale figure tilted its head further, the motion impossibly slow, like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. "You wanted," it said, its voice dripping with mockery. "And I gave. But you never asked what it would cost." "I never asked for this," James shouted, his fists pounding against the unyielding wall. "You asked for not to be alone," the figure whispered, and its voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Loneliness eats at you. It hollows you. You called out in your emptiness, and I answered." James stumbled into the living room, the walls swirling around him, warping and twisting like a living nightmare. All evidence of Daniel's existence had vanished. The photo frames were empty, his drawings were gone, even the indentations on the couch where they used to sit together had smoothed out, as if erasing the memory of his weight. "I loved him," James said, his voice breaking. "He was my son." The creature stood, its elongated form unfolding with an unnatural grace. It stepped forward, each movement deliberate, its faceless head leaning toward James. "He was never yours. He was a fragment, a piece of me shaped to fill your hollow heart." James dropped to his knees, his hands clawing at the floor as sobs racked his body. "Then why let me love him? Why let me hope?" The creature leaned closer, its distorted form looming over him. "Because," it whispered, "hope makes the feast all the sweeter." James screamed, the sound raw and primal, as the figure reached for him with spindly, clawed fingers. The walls seemed to close in, the air heavy with a suffocating pressure. Darkness encroached, creeping in from the edges of his vision, and the last thing he saw was the creature's pale, featureless face hovering inches from his own. And then there was silence. When James woke, he was alone. The house was silent, empty, and devoid of any warmth. The echoes of laughter, the sound of Daniel's tiny footsteps, the joy he had felt, all of it was gone. The only thing that remained was the crushing weight of his solitude, more oppressive now than ever before. He sat in the middle of the barren living room, staring at his trembling hands. Somewhere, deep in the recesses of his mind, he could still hear the creature's voice, mocking and cruel. "You will never forget me, not anymore." Abigail couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her since she'd moved in with James. It wasn't just the sleepless nights or the way his eyes seemed to linger too long on certain blank spots on the walls. It was the silence, the heavy, oppressive kind that felt alive, crawling into every corner of the house and her mind. She had stopped mentioning the strange sounds she heard at night. The first time she'd brought it up, James had dismissed it as the house settling, but his tone was too clipped, his reaction too abrupt, and she'd learned not to press. The scuttling sounds didn't stop, though, and the odd, fleeting shapes she caught from the corner of her eye seemed more frequent now. Abigail had started dreaming about children. Sometimes, she held a baby girl with James's eyes and her smile. Other times, the child was a formless shadow, clinging to her with a cold grip that sent her waking in a sweat. She would find James already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall like he was trying to remember something just out of reach. The nights James sleepwalked were the worst. He would rise silently, moving with a strange, deliberate grace, his face blank, his eyes open but unseeing. Abigail tried to guide him back to bed once, but he brushed past her, murmuring something under his breath that she couldn't quite make out. She thought it sounded like a name. "James," she whispered one night, finding him in the hallway, standing perfectly still and staring at a blank wall. "Are you awake?" He didn't respond. His lips moved soundlessly, and Abigail felt a chill race down her spine. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "James, you're scaring me." This time, he spoke. His voice was low, distant, almost like someone else's. A father should know. "What?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James turned to her then, his eyes unfocused, as if looking through her rather than at her. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. And then, without warning, he turned back to the wall, pressed his hand against it, and let out a deep, shuddering breath. He muttered one final word before collapsing into her arms, unconscious. The word was Daniel. Abigail sat on the floor with him, trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know a Daniel, and James had always insisted he'd never had children. But there was a sadness in his sleep-stricken face, a hollow ache she couldn't understand. The next morning, James acted as if nothing had happened. He kissed her cheek, made coffee, and went about his day with the same quiet melancholy that had become his norm. Abigail didn't bring up the name. She couldn't, but the thought stayed with her. She found herself searching James's expressions, his movements, his silences, for some hint of the life he might have had before her. And in the quiet moments, when she was alone in the house, she would find herself drawn to the same blank wall where James had stood, her hand reaching out, fingertips grazing the smooth surface. She didn't know what she expected to find, but deep down, in the quiet recesses of her mind, Abigail began to feel that something was watching her back. And somewhere, in the shadows of the house, something was